Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode. Today, our guest is Saqib Sheikh from the Rohingya Project, heading up the Rohingya Project and doing his PhD work on the Rohingya in Myanmar. It's so nice to have you here today.
Well, it's a pleasure, Shaiel. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with get right into the topic. Terrible crisis in Myanmar, not covered anywhere near enough by the media, as we know. How did we get here? Why is there such a terrible conflict in Myanmar today?
Yeah, I mean it's been sort of decades in the making. It's not something new, but as you mentioned, it hasn't really caught the headlines in the West, and there are several reasons for that. One, I think the biggest is that it's not really a country, Myanmar, that is aligned geostrategically with any major interests of the United States, and therefore it doesn't really factor into many of the sort of major news items that we look at compared to the Middle East or Europe. But the conflict has been ongoing for decades, and the prime sort of you could say culprit or the prime factor in the conflict is essentially the military which runs the country, the Tatmadaw that's called, or the military junta in Myanmar, who you could argue, except for a very brief period of democracy that happened recently, have been in charge of the country for the last 60 plus years. 1962, the Tatmadaw overthrew the elected government, which was there since the country's independence in 1948, and they've been ruling as the main majority stakeholder in the state since then. And Myanmar is a very sort of interesting case, especially if you compare it to Western style liberal democracies. It's a very different type of setup to how the state is built. And you could call it ethnocracy in the sense that the various ethnicities, and there's many different ethnicities that make up the state in Myanmar, they all have sort of an assigned state sanctioned place within the state, and that becomes sort of the avenue in which a lot of them get citizenship as well. But it's those various ethnicities, those various minority groups that tend to also be at loggerheads with the military, especially in the borderline regions around Myanmar. Now, Myanmar is it's situated in an interesting place because it's at sort of the juxtaposition of Southeast Asia with South Asia, literally the borderland where a lot of the Rohingya conflict is with Bangladesh. That's where South Asia, the subcontinent, meets the Southeast Asian region, and because of that, there's a rich cultural diversity country. But you also end up having across the borderlands many of different ethnic groups fighting for autonomy or independence. The case that's received the most headlines has been the Rohingya, but there are also several other ethnic groups like the Karen, the Kachin, the Chin, who also at certain levels are persecuted by the main military regime. When I talk about the ethnocracy, there is a name to what that system is given. It's called Tangyinta. And the idea with that is that your ethnicity becomes sort of a pathway. If you're a member of a recognized ethnicity, you gain citizenship through that. And this is enshrined in Myanmar in 1982 through a citizenship law in which they give, you could say, a list of designated ethnicities, and those are the ones that are sort of enshrined and given constitutional rights. Now, we'll talk more about the Rohingya case and how that that sort of became the starting point of much of the plight of the Rohingya. But that's sort of an overview of how the state is kind of structured. Sometimes I wonder how Myanmar keeps together, but the military has somewhat of a firm hold, and it's right now governing through martial law. So that's sort of how Myanmar is at the moment. It's also worth pointing out that for the military to keep a hold, they do promote, and they have promoted for a number of decades, this idea of Barmanization. So Barmar, you could say, is sort of the shorthand for Burman, or this idea of this main ethnic majority of the country, who are ethnic Burmese. And the idea is that the state should reflect that, the nature of that main ethnic majority. And all the other smaller ethnic minorities have to find their place constituted around that main ethnic majority, the Barmar people. And that has been a state policy running for decades. And it's also sort of one of the sources of the conflict because the state tries to push a particular cultural and ethnic lens to which is reflected in the script and in the quotas, the placements of key officials. And that creates a lot of strife with the other ethnic groups who feel more marginalized. So hopefully that gives you sort of a bird's eye view of the state at the moment.
I have a question. So this system that you're talking about, and you're saying that you basically have to join an ethnic group to you have to join an ethnic group to be a citizen. So are there ethnic groups that are existent but not officially listed to where they would have to basically give up their ethnic identity in which to receive rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a good segue to the Rohingya case themselves, because the Rohingya are actually that
Okay.
population that are effectively delisted from that 1982 citizenship law, and that became the root cause of their statelessness. It isn't the case, though, as you mentioned, that you can just sort of switch and join into another ethnicity, because those ethnicities tend to have, I mean, their own sort of demarcators, and just joining one group, uh, it's sort of listed in your ID card which group you're part of, um, and once that's set, it's very difficult to just switch and change your identity altogether. The Rohingya case, Myanmar gained independence in at that time it was Burma in 1948, and before that it was a majority sort of British colony. If you go back until 1784 was the date where the British sort of colonized Burma. And then they introduced many ways this system of communalism, which was also in the subcontinent, where different ethnicities had specific sort of places within the structure of the state. And then, as you can imagine, post independence, a lot of that system was inherited, where there's an ethnic flavor to how the state sort of conducts itself. But the Rohingya, they trace themselves, they're sort of an Indo-Aryan group of people who trace their sort of lineage before even the British past centuries, where their kingdom, which is on the borderland between Burma and Bangladesh, is what was called Arakan. Now it's called Rakhine State, and that always had a Muslim population to which sort of the Rohingya trace their lineage. And then that post independence, they were still an accepted minority of Burma. They were given, place within the parliament. They had their own official language on the state broadcasters. It was very much an accepted minority, but slowly, beginning with the military takeover and this idea that the state needs to push a particular Burman character or a Burmanization, that is where the troubles for the Rohingya started, because they were increasingly starting to be seen by not just the military regime, but also a portion of the populace as a foreign element, and people who were sort of not in line with the rest of the sort of accepted minorities. And we could talk more about that. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I tried to use that to sort of bring the Rohingya into the case, because the Rohingya are the main population who've been suffered from this type of law, where you have to be listed by the state as an official ethnicity to gain citizenship.
So how much is that system of stressing these different ethnic identities responsible for what we're seeing today?
I think it's hard to just place it only on the system, but it is definitely a major issue, because the otherization that happens of the Rohingya stems from the fact that many of them are seen as outsiders. And there's a history to how that happened, but it's very much a sense where many different minorities are sort of competing for their own ethnic interests, in some cases for political autonomy, but they're also contesting for a place within the state. And that that case that became the very basis for which they were removed as citizens. So within the the period of the 1970s to the 1990s is where there was sort of this steady drift where many of the Rohingya people, because they're in this borderland region, they were accused of being Bengali, as in immigrants or people people from Bangladesh who had crossed the border and were illegally occupying that area in Arakan, the Rakhine state. And because ethnicity, the idea of indigeneity, is such a key facet to how Myanmar is constituted, that became the major point of contestation for why they're there. It became the basis for them being stripped of citizenship. So what happened with the 1982 law is once that law was passed, effectively overnight, the Rohingya were stripped of citizenship. Whereas they had national ID cards before that, overnight they became bereft of their own nationality. So they were formally barred from access to basic facilities like schools, or you could say, aside from schools, employment, being able to get jobs in areas in the state. So their statelessness, the main cause is this idea that they are an invading force or they are manufactured identity, somewhat similar to how Palestinians are often called Egyptians, because Egypt tends to be a neighboring country. So to cast aspersion and to delegitimize their aspiration for nationality, they're considered a manufactured people who have culturally just concocted an identity. And it's very similar in the Rohingya case by, unfortunately, it's not just the military regime, but a good chunk of the population have been sort of fed that propaganda that the Rohingya are these people from Bangladesh who have occupied or have just infiltrated into the country and have taken over this region of Arakan. Now, Arakan itself, historically, there's a Buddhist population there called the Rakhine people, who the state derives its name from that, the Rakhine state, who have lived and coexisted with the Muslim Rohingya population fairly peacefully until only recently. And I would say what really triggered this sort of current wave of conflict was in 2012, where you had sort of state-sanctioned pogroms where the Buddhist minority, the Rakhine people, and the Rohingya, conflict between them was facilitated under the guidance of the state, essentially, to sort of egg on this ethnic conflict. Very much a divide and rule policy. And that happens in other states as well. But that was a facilitator for this idea that the Rohingya are this problem, that they're a demographic problem because they had such a big majority in the state, and that they're a problem that has to be dealt with. And that from that 2012 period, that's what sort of led to their expulsion eventually in 2017. They've been sort of, I guess I should say, systematically kicked out in waves. You had in the 1970s through military operations, you had in the 1990s, and the most recent one was in 2017, which is what is now commonly referred to as a genocide, where there was a triggering incident on August 25th. There are some parallels between that and sort of kind of what Israel, how they frame October 7th. But the October 25th one was mainly directed at police outposts of the military regime by Rohingya militants. There's a militant group called ARSA, or the Arakan Salvation Army, that had launched an operation against several military and police outposts. And then the military, in response, said that we're going to launch a sort of full-fledged campaign against the militants. It was less vague language. The idea was that they were going to do a massacre of the Rohingya. And many of the Rohingya, they're mostly farmers. You know, they're not like the most literate people, because they've been disenfranchised from educational access. So they're mostly farmers. Many of them had to flee their ancestral villages and cross into Bangladesh. And over 700,000 actually ended up leaving. And there was a campaign of mass rape and killing. Over 30,000 to 40,000 Rohingya died within that period of a few months in 2017. Upon crossing the border, this refugee camp in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh ended up becoming the largest refugee camp in the world, and is now housing over 1.1 million Rohingya. So the present situation for the Rohingya globally is that there's less than 1 million Rohingya who are left in their homeland in Arakan or Rakhine State, and the majority of the Rohingya have been scattered to Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Malaysia, where I was doing my field work as part of my PhD. And the present situation right now is whether the Rohingya are able to return back home or not, and uh, whether Myanmar can actually address its main issues with its ethnic minorities, not just the Rohingya, but the various other, you could say, battles it's having with populations across its borderlands. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers that question.
Yeah, I have so many follow-up questions. I don't even know where to start. Let's go back a bit. Let's go back. So you talked about how there's a sense in Myanmar that the ethnicity of the Rohingya has been invented. What is the true history of the Rohingya? How did that identity actually come to be, and what are the differences between that and the mythology that the Rohingya manufacture and the mythology that the government manufactures? Sort of how do these myths and reality reconcile?
I mean, that's a very good question. It's a very, I'll just say it's a very controversial question. You can imagine, right? Because you're going to have Burmese nationalists or Myanmar nationalists who are very much adamant that there's no historical basis for the Rohingya. And then the Rohingya have their own sort of narrative, which traces their lineage to the first sort of Muslim traders who came in, I think out of the 9th century. The truth is that it's very hard to establish like clear lines of ethnogenesis, as they call it. Uh, what what we do know, for example, is that when Arakan was its independent kingdom in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, uh, it did have a large Muslim population, right? Even if it was living with a large Buddhist population, mostly peacefully. And the Rohingya sort of trace their roots there. When the British um, colonized Burma, it included the area of Arakan. What a lot of the sort of Burmese nationalists point to is that, the British ended up importing a lot of Bengali laborers into that region, and they contest that that's the basis for the Rohingya having this presence here, and that it's more a matter of convenience post-independence that the Rohingya claim to have an ethnicity, whereas they all historically stem from Bengali people who were brought by the British. Now, the reality is that the Rohingya actually have a very culturally distinct ethnic identity from many of the Bengali people. It's a separate language. It has its own cultural customs. But when we're talking about times before nation states, a lot of these cultures sort of blended together. I mean, in the sense that, there was not like distinct national boundaries. So you could have in a borderland area cultures that sort of bleed together, and that you could have cases where there's cross migration. That doesn't mean that there isn't a indigenous character to a people to a land, which is what I believe based on from my research on the Rohingya, that they do trace a lineage that is, you could say, somewhat distinct, but also a product of many ethnicities in that region sort of living harmoniously together as they did for centuries. But this idea of a sort of firm political construct of one people as a Rohingya, that's more, I mean, recently with the inception of nationalism and the idea that you have to establish an ethnic basis to a state. So it's sort of in between. And I would put this actually with many people. In fact, most ethnic groups, at least in the global south or even across lines, that before you actually had to define yourself in political terms, you were still a cultural people. But yeah, what the reality is that if you lived in, especially a border region, there's cross migration, there is intermarriage between people. It isn't as resolutely concrete or distinct as we have to sort of make it in a performative way, and that I think applies to many nationalities as well. So uh, it's hard to present it the way it is now, because now the Rohingya people, they are much more distinct in terms of they have a cultural but also political identity as a persecuted group, and they have their claims as well. But I don't think if we have to use these claims as a basis for citizenship, I do think that they have a valid claim. I just feel that, I mean, I don't think it should be the basis for citizenship in Myanmar. I think what
Right.
they're trying to move towards is civic nationalism, or just, a democracy for all who happen to live in the States. That would be the solution for that, rather than having to establish your ethnic claims for citizenship. So does that give you a sense of the answer?
Yeah, I would actually also argue that like all ethnicities, all cultures, all of that stuff, it's all invented. It's just a question of when, and what causes a people to be a people is that they said that they're a people. This was the whole American insight with the Declaration of Independence. Is what makes a people is they said they were a people. And there's all instances of offshoots of different cultures that are exactly that, where they just said, hey, you know what, we don't like what you're doing here. And so to me, the question of when and all of that is really irrelevant anyway. The question is are these people, do they have rights? And I think that's why you're correct when you say that the solution there seems to be that we need to just go, hey, these people are in Myanmar. They've been here forever. It doesn't matter what they call themselves. They need to be able to have a say in the government, and they need to be able to vote, and they need to have rights. And it
Yeah,
shouldn't be
I think
attached to what group you're in.
right. I would agree with that. It's but you can understand if you're like a Rohingya or Palestinian or whatever. Yeah, it's very sensitive because you're being attacked. That the whole basis of you being a people is just concocted and completely manufactured. So you're gonna reassert all the claims that you have. Like in the Rohingya case, they'll point to that in the you had British officers or cases where they use the word Rohingya in one of their journals, for example, or they'll looking through the archives and they'll see that Rohingya were fighting in the British Army on behalf of the Allies. These are all like claims that they can make. I mean, I would agree that I wouldn't want to have to assert ethnic claims to the basis of having rights of citizenship, but it is a sensitive issue because at no point am I saying that they don't exist as their own distinct people, because
Right.
I
Neither am
genuinely believe
I.
they do. But the problem, we live in this era of nation states where and how the British created the states were also, you almost can be conspiratorial minded to think that they wanted to create conflict as their sort of legacy. I mean, so my parents, even though I'm Pakistani American, my parents are from Pakistan, and actually, if you look at history, originally that area that the Rohingya had was at the time of partition of the subcontinent, that was supposed to be part of East Pakistan, which now is Bangladesh. So that region was supposed to be part of East Pakistan at the time of partition. And the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had initially agreed to that idea, which may have saved a lot of conflict. But that decision was later reversed and ended up becoming part of Burma. You could argue it's part of it. It could be a contiguous region because they're also a Muslim. At least North Arakan could be part of that region, but it didn't end up being so. And then, as we see in many cases, like post-colonial border states end up having bloody borders, which is unfortunate. What can you do though? We're in this era. Like I
Yeah, they
when
were
I
drawing
hear
lines
the
to
Israel,
split between empires, not really to draw good lines.
yeah, yeah. But we could also say that these cultures do exist. Like it's not enough to say that like no culture exists, because there's
Right.
mixing and
No, I'm just
the,
saying that what creates a culture is people have assembled and said there's a culture. So I'm
yes,
saying it doesn't really matter when that happened. And that's really
right,
what we're actually arguing about, because every culture was invented at one point or another. But like that's kind of my point is we're trying to create a validity based on how old something is, when in reality it's
exactly.
whether or not it exists. It's a reality. It is or it isn't.
Well, yeah, I actually say the same to those who sort of contest Palestinian national identity, which is that Well, they think they're Palestinian, even if you don't accept it, right? It's not like the Egyptians think they're Palestinian, the Palestinians think they're Palestinian. They have their own.
The
They've developed
Jordanians
it
think
by
they're
now, right?
Palestinian.
So even if you want to go into history, which seems very pedantic, I think it's kind of established that they have their own uniqueness now. To me, I don't think it's completely besides the point. It is important to establish some history of a people.
Right.
Yeah,
I just think it's irrelevant
fact
to
is,
the rights
if they exist,
question.
yeah, if they exist independently and have this distinct sense of group consciousness, then I don't see any basis to deny them that. And unfortunately, that's the case now, which is that they're stateless. They've been disenfranchised of basic rights. Even as refugees in many of these Muslim countries, they face restrictions. They're not formally accepted or given citizenship rights. And there's that dilemma which is also exists in the Palestinian case, which is that do you give them citizenship, but then you sort of delegitimize their stake of returning back home and becoming citizens of Myanmar, which should be the ultimate restitution of justice, of repatriating them back home, which again, unfortunately, the region right now in Arakan is in civil war between the Burmese army and then the local Rakhine people who are mostly Buddhists who have their own sort of ethnic group called the Arakan army who are sort of fighting together, and the Rohingya are sort of in between that. The remaining Rohingya who are stuck there. So it is a problem because you want to repatriate the Rohingya back, especially those who are nearby in Bangladesh and the camps, which have become really deteriorated in terms of the conditions, really bad. But you can only do that when the situation is safe and when you can assure that they'll be given citizenship rights. Otherwise, you're going to land them back in the same situation that they were in before, which is a big problem. Let me know if I'm
So
rambling, Shaiel.
No, you're not
I
at all.
have an interesting question that I would ask is, so from what I understand, you have the Burmese population is the majority of the state, and you have the ethnic groups around the basically the exterior that are having issues with and these are all different minority comparative groups, but they're fighting for democracy, and it seems like the only backing that the militant, the junta has is these Burmese. I'm talking about actually population wise. So I'm just kind of, I guess, wondering why, even if you're Burmese, you're even resisting the idea of a democracy that you would rule anyway.
Yeah, so it is
Does that
important
make
to
any
establish.
sense?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to establish some context, which is that, after a long period of military rule in Burma, beginning in the 2010s, there was this sort of transition to at least some level of democratic representation. And we had the very famous figure of Aung San Suu Kyi, who was under house arrest for a long time. Her father was also a leader, former leader of Burma, who she became this Western darling as a democratic sort of avatar. And upon her release, there were actually elections in 2015 where you had the National League of for Democracy, the NLD, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, voted into power. And it was a very tenuous situation because it still seemed that the military held the actual levers of power and that this was more of a democratic, I guess, one
Facade.
layer on top of the state. And there was always a question of to what extent there was actual democracy that had roots within the country and whether the military could be held accountable. And what quickly happened is, unfortunately, even though she was representative of, and she had broad support from at least the main ethnic group, but also different groups in Burma who there was a brief period where it seemed that there could be a more longstanding effort to seek some type of peace with many of the ethnic groups and to allow them to live sort of under one united Myanmar. But what happened that period of 2017 was under her leadership. It wasn't under martial law. And she became a full accomplice to the military's campaign, and justifying in many cases that what's happening is merely self-defense, and also echoing many of the same tropes about the Rohingya that the populace, or at least a section of the populace, feel. So that has created this skepticism within many of the Rohingya, but also, many global observers as well, about the extent to which democracy can address many of these lingering ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. Right now, in 2021, the military took over again under martial law, so they removed the NLD. And since then, it's been mainly putting out fires and trying to keep the country stable. But you also have a democratic movement outside the country, this NUG, the National Unity Government, that is trying to set itself in place as the government in waiting and push a democratic transition. It hasn't made much headway, mainly because it's fractured also among itself. And one of the contested points that Western advocates say is that you need to ensure that whatever transition happens in Myanmar has to be a pure democracy, in a sense that the basis for citizenship has to be actually that you're living in that place, and that all of these ethnic groups don't have to establish an ethnocratic claim to citizenship. So that's been one of the points that has been stressed. At least, I would say, in official statements, Democratic movement has recognized the Rohingya. They've acknowledged that the Rohingya have to be given their sort of rights as part of a new Myanmar post any military presence. A lot of the Rohingya who I work with are very skeptical of that, given what happened last time under democracy and under Aung San Suu Kyi. So it isn't the case that we can just say that removing the type of regime would change the problem. You also have to sort of de-radicalize a section of the public that still imbibe these kind of notions of the Rohingya being this foreign presence, and really change this notion of the civic consciousness of the people of Myanmar. That's a much bigger sort of task at the moment. And whether that happens or not, we'll just have to see. But I think that's a precondition for the Rohingya returning back, because there's no point in Rohingya returning back and not being given citizenship, and just returning to the same state of marginalization that they had before.
Tell us a little bit more about that dilemma. Very familiar from the Middle East, about anything that you do to make the refugees feel comfortable where they've been exiled to seems to undercut the political pressure on the country to bring them back. But on the other hand, that risks treating the refugees as, and it really seems insoluble. I think that just from the human rights perspective, the most important thing, especially learning the lesson of what we've learned with Palestinian refugees, is to make the lives of the refugees as comfortable and as humane as possible by integrating them into the society, because people aren't weapons. But a lot of people look at that as a betrayal. Is that the case in
Well, I mean, that's my entire PhD topic is about how Rohingya sort of integrate as a stateless people. And what my case I look at is mostly Malaysia, where unfortunately since COVID there's been a lot
Is
of
Malaysia the
rise
biggest
of
group?
Sorry?
Malaysia the biggest presence of Rohingya refugees?
No. So Malaysia is the biggest one of this current wave of refugees. So there are historic Rohingya who came in after the first expulsions in the 1970s, and they're mostly in Saudi Arabia and in Pakistan. And their case is slightly different because they've had more of a historical presence in those countries. But in Malaysia, there's around 200,000 or 150, I would say, thousand Rohingya who have mostly come in the last 10 to 15 years since this conflict has spiked. And what I sort of work with is how does sort of Malaysian society integrate these people, given that there's that dilemma, like if you give them citizenship, then that removes your stake for them being repatriated back to their homeland. And a lot of them want to go back to their homeland. In fact, all of them who I talk to, they want to go back. They have emotional, visceral connection to their land of origin. It's defines them as a people. In fact, I would say for any ethnic group, there's sort of two major factors that make an ethnic group. One is land, the other is language. These are two sort of key factors in making any ethnic group distinctive, which in Urdu we say Zameen and Zaban, and it's a similar thing in Rohingya language as well. But you need to have your place of origin, and you need to have a common dialogue that your group speaks in that is distinctive. They have that dialogue, but as they're disconnected from their homeland, they feel that dislocation. And that's the area of statelessness that people often underestimate because we're products of this modern world. So, I like traveling, I like relocating in different places, but you'll always have a connection to a land of origin. And if your land of origin is sort of denied its own ability to be like allow your own people there, have your own presence, no matter where you are, you'll feel kind of out of sorts as a people. You'll wonder where your place is in the world. Even if you give a person citizenship, as long as their land of origin is in turmoil or denied statehood, in the case of Palestinians, there is what we call social statelessness, that you're a member of a stateless people. That's a different type of statelessness than just being undocumented or being denied nationality or citizenship in another country. And I find it kind of interesting because I think that identity is coming to define us in this modern age. We have identity politics in the United States. It's sort of the defining factor in politics globally. And if you're a member of a stateless group, it still applies. It just applies in a very different way. And sometimes what I observe is even if you have opportunities to get state citizenship in certain countries, and I'm not saying this applies to everybody, but in many cases, you may choose to withdraw or exclude yourself from integrating to maintain being your own type of people, which seems counterintuitive, but there is a strong desire in many to remain, remain part of a coherent people and to keep that narrative of your people going on. We saw that actually even in Tibet, where many Tibetans who were sort of kicked out and then moved to India, they refused to get Indian citizenship and they remained stateless because they felt that that's a political statement that they wanted to make, even at the cost of the rights of citizenship. And so we don't know actually how to solve that dilemma. Even in the Palestinian case, I really get annoyed where many of those who advocate against the Palestinians try and say, well, why doesn't Egypt accept them, or why don't these other countries give them citizenship? And they can't understand a very sort of fundamental point, which is that they already have their stake at home, which is in Palestine, and they don't want to give that up. And especially, I feel if you come from a nationalist background, which many of them do, they should be able to, that should resonate with them, right? It's not just a transactional exchange for livelihood or for healthcare, but it's a matter of identity. And that is a big driver of a lot of these
this
conflicts.
is something when me and Shaiel actually first met, I remember I asked him about this because it's something that, like, if you go back to, Hitler and the Holocaust and the lead up to that, he was screaming, hey, if you have a problem with the way that I'm treating these guys, take them. And if you go and you look, there were meetings between the French and the US and all that, and they were like, well, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. And that was basically the question was, basically, are we going to, they decided to play chicken with these people's lives. They were like, hey, we're going to basically make them do it. We don't think he'll do it. And like, it's a repeating cycle for, aspects of genocides and ethnic cleansings that, like, the guy, the perpetrator generally is like, just take the guys, I'll, before I end up getting rid of them, basically. And I don't know what the exact solution is, because I do agree that you kind of remove that pressure. But like I said, again, I feel like we're playing chicken with people's lives when we do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's true, and there is no easy solution to that. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't, because you want to help people alleviate the tough conditions of their lives, but at the same time, you don't want to deny their right of self determination, the right of return, things that have driven them, motivate them as a people and keep them distinct from a people. One of these aspects of genocide is, and I should elaborate a bit about the work my project does. So the Rohingya project that we work on, I have a co-founder who's Rohingya as well. We've been since the genocide in 2017. What we focus on is a lot on identity, and in particular, statelessness, and the idea that the Rohingya themselves they're sort of at threat. They face an existential threat because over a few generations, assuming they don't return back home, if they're assimilated in all these sort of host societies, they sort of lose the Rohingya people are gone in a sense, right? That's just sort of an existential threat of integration and assimilation. And, when I say that, a lot of people say, well, that's sort of history, right? People come, they migrate, they assimilate, they become integrate into new and they form different people. And I say, yeah, actually, that's true. But the problem is that in their case, they were targeted as part of a genocidal campaign with that precise purpose to end them and to end their sort of cultural integrity as a people. So what we try and do is we work very much on digital heritage, trying to because during the campaign in 2017, many of the Rohingya ancestral villages, in fact, most of them were burned down, uh, and those are sort of villages they've been living on for generations and generations, and many of the Rohingya trace their heritage to these villages. So we're trying to digitally reconstruct and preserve a lot of the Rohingya heritage for themselves now, but also for their generations to come, and then also work on educating Rohingya in their own language, being able to provide them resources so that they can understand more about their own identity as a people, because they're not I mean, they've been denied education, so many of them can't read or write, and that's also a problem. So that we've been focused on identity as sort of a key issue for the Rohingya, which is very important, and especially in context, I guess, of Gaza, where you have an entire area that's been eviscerated, and that area isn't just schools and hospitals, but it's also a tremendous sort of cultural legacy and heritage that's gone effectively, and you can't really rebuild that. That's a problem, right? Once that's gone, you sort of have to start from zero. Though I'm very hopeful with the Palestinian case that they will always sort of maintain their honor and integrity as people, and they have their own cultural legacy as well. But that's kind of the work we've been doing, because there isn't within this whole humanitarian sphere, when it comes to like aid distribution, when it comes to helping with like malnutrition in the camps, there's a lot of humanitarian supplies and resources for that, though I would say less so since Ukraine started. But there's very little attention that's paid to these type of issues of statelessness, which we've been trying to address, and it'll remain an issue, unfortunately.
So, what's the current military situation in Myanmar itself? In this case, very similar, I guess, to in Gaza. There was a conflict going that was around the time of the genocide that was quite bloody, even if I remember correctly. How is that military element developed? That's often kind of neglected when we talk about these humanitarian elements, but that's ultimately what decides on the ground what happens.
Yeah, that's true. I should point out that the U.S. has recognized what happened in 2017. In 2021, they recognized it as a genocide. And what's surprising is they recognize it as a genocide, even though the ICJ has not really ruled it as a genocide yet. The case of it being a genocide, which is brought by Gambia to the ICJ, is still actually being deliberated in court, which kind of sort of hints that even the case with Gaza may take some time before the ICJ actually comes with a verdict, because the Rohingya case happened in 2017 and it hasn't been adjudicated upon.
In 2017,
Yeah,
it was
in terms of
referred to the ICJ.
the ICJ, yeah, the ICJ.
In
Yes.
2017, that long ago.
Yeah, so in 2017 is when the genocide happened, and then 2019 is when
19.
Gambia uh, petitioned
That's government
to the
efficiency for you.
ICJ. Yeah, so then it's been 6 years and still sort of going through the work.
Honestly, that's ridiculous. Really, I mean, I stand up for the ICJ all the time. They should pay me, considering how much I stand up for them. But they're just so inefficient. People are dying. Why does it take 6 years to? Why? I mean, how many years is it going to take? I can understand it taking like 2-3 years, but
Yeah,
live
that's
in
why
reality.
it is frustrating because you want you want, like you said, you want to stand up for international institutions, but you want them to also be at least swift in justice. Uh,
Work.
and I'm not. Yeah, I mean, there's geopolitics there. I mean, I wouldn't say know if it applies with the ICJ. I mean, they're definitely, for example, China is a main partner of Myanmar, right? In many cases, they stick up for them internationally, right? Even that region of Arakan, as because it's a littoral, as in it's a shoreline to the Pacific, so there's a vested interest in having that developed as a pathway for China to have supply
So that's
lines to
kind of a
the Pacific.
curiosity to me is how this did not end up being China's Ukraine.
Yeah.
How did
Well, no,
this not, how did the US not end up playing that game? Because I do know that China has not really picked any sides in this conflict and has basically made a pretty loud declaration that if you touch my crap in the country, I'm coming for whoever did it. And I know that there are actually people setting up camps underneath these pipelines that China built because they know they're the only safe spot from the bombings because they will neither side will touch them because they don't want to incur the wrath of China. So I'm kind of wondering, given the way that the US likes to play games with proxy conflicts and given we're not necessarily the friendliest with China, why haven't we played that game?
I,
Does
I
that
think
make
it's
any
interesting.
sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. One thing I would say is China. China has long time been an ally of the military junta there. It's not really in their interest, but they're sort of a soft ally in the sense that they don't necessarily, they kind of stay silent on more of the abuses. There are also some ethnic groups, like the Karen, who sort of have a close affiliation with China because of the border region. But I think from the United States standpoint, they're looking at cases where there isn't a big geostrategic vested interest, like Myanmar, is a great way for them to burnish their credentials as like, okay, here's where we can present that we're pro democracy. So if there's a military
Or
junta
the good
there,
guys.
right, we are going to support the democratic movement. We condemn that. If there was a genocide, which happened in 2017, then under Biden in 2021, they're going to say, yeah, that was a genocide. You know, it's our way to sort of establish our credentials as, this sort of bastion of human rights. But it is sad that the U.S. government could issue a statement that's a genocide, but the ICJ hasn't ruled on that. Now, back to sort of Shael's question on the military state of the conflict. So, in Rakhine State, you have a standoff between two main sort of parties in which the Rohingya are sort of caught in between. First is the Tatmadaw, the military junta that is trying to reconquer that region and have it under their complete control. And they only have a certain portion of the state under their control. The other is the Arakan army, which they're constituted mainly by this ethnic Buddhist group called the Rakhine, who are also indigenous to that area, who have claimed a certain portion of, or I mean, you could almost say a majority of the state. And they're locked in this ongoing conflict for who has control. And the Arakan army, they seek to establish the control of the whole Rakhine state and then have it be a separate entity, if not autonomous from Burma, from Myanmar itself. So there is this ongoing struggle. And now the few remaining Rohingya within the state, less than 1 million, they're either stuck in detainment camps. It's sort of this apartheid state regime where they're stuck in these internment camps there, or they're either on the front lines fighting fighting for either force. In fact, I have a recent article that talks about how, in a very cynical way, the Burmese army, even though it wasn't considering the Rohingya as citizens, they fell short on supplies and soldiers. So what they decided to do is have a new conscription law, and they went to the Rohingya community and says, if you fight as frontline soldiers, then we're going to give you citizenship. And what happened is they managed to get an initial conscript of Rohingya soldiers to fight the Arakan army. Of course, they didn't give them citizenship. They ended up lying about that. But many of the Rohingya are being sort of conscripted to fight on behalf of their genociders at gunpoint. Unfortunately, they're this other side of the conflict, and so they're really caught in the worst of all worlds. And it doesn't appear to be abating. Now, there is a situation where if this Buddhist ethnic indigenous group, the Rakhine, if they establish claim over the entire state and break it off essentially from the rest of Myanmar, there's a question there if they would facilitate the Rohingya to come back into their state, because they would want to establish their international legitimacy by disassociating themselves from the sort of evil of the Tatmadaw. And initially they made that statement that, yeah, we will accept sort of the Rohingya back. The question, though, is that they also have an ethnic view of the makeup of the state. So would they accept 1 million Rohingya back to their homeland is also questionable. That's kind of the situation where the conflict is at the moment. It's kind of at a loggerheads. It's still ongoing, and it isn't a foregone conclusion that the military junta will collapse, but it does seem that they are weak at the moment. So I wouldn't put my cards on them necessarily claiming the whole state back under their authority.
The sources of their weakness.
Many of their the fact that they have to do a conscription law is one indication, because many of their soldiers ended up fleeing. There was also a case that after 2021, when they did this recent martial law, they lost a lot of Western support. Because in 2015, when this quasi-democracy setup was established, there was a lot of money rushing into Myanmar, because it seemed that it would be the next, sort of West Coast gold rush, and there was a lot of money rushing into Myanmar. This idea that it would really become a bustling state.
I have a friend who lost millions, literally millions on that. Yeah.
But then that all collapsed under the martial law. So a lot of money left the state. It became more diplomatically isolated. Many of their accounts, there was flight of capital, but also flight of people within the ranks of the army. The support became much more tenuous among the population. So that's led to this type of desperation on their part. They still have a lot. They have existing military alliances with countries in the region like China, even Pakistan, and India. But at the same time, they've been weakened in terms of their support.
Yeah,
From what I understand,
go for it, Daniel.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. From what I understand, the actual the military, like the battlefield per se, from the start of this was you had like the main military bases, then you had these little satellite bases that were like, you'd have a little bit of a bunch of people, and a little bit of equipment, but it wasn't like a main base. And then from there, you'd have like little splinter factions of battalions. And
Outposts.
the outpost, where the original fight came in, they started, attacking the outposts, which caused them to retreat back to those medium-sized bases. And then they started actually taking some of these medium-sized bases, but now they're at the point where they're these major bases that have like they're now pretty much all retreated back to and heavily fortified. And it's kind of like a stalemate because they don't really have the power to overpower these major bases. That's what I have been reading personally.
Yeah, so the military, they have this strategy they call the 4 cuts, where they try and sort of separate between any insurgent force which, some of them are the Rohingya, some of them are the Arakan army. They try and cut off their supply lines, food, their finances, intelligence, and their recruits. So the idea is that they want to sort of encircle any insurgent force, but they haven't been able to do that with the Arakan army because the Arakan army have been very well stocked and sort of well managed. They have a fighting force of around 10,000 soldiers who are quite equipped, and then they're stretched thin across the entire country, sort of putting out these fires. They are going to hold elections soon. These are sort of sham elections where the military officials and their party tends to get a wide share of people. Obviously, it's just meant to rubber stamp their authority already. But there are a lot of people who wonder what happens if the military collapses under its own weight and what comes after that. Because I think there's a real sort of concern that whether the state would be contiguous after that or not, it's sort of hard to gauge, right? Even the most sort of tight knit authoritarian regime looks great until the day it sort of collapses. Even when Assad left to Moscow, like all the frailties and the weaknesses in a regime became much more apparent after he fled, right? It was harder to telegraph before that he's at the verge of leaving. So yeah, that's kind of that situation.
Is there any element of proxy war here? Because usually when we talk to people about a conflict, we spend half the time talking about who's supporting who and why everything is foreigners' fault. And this one seems really relatively self-contained. It almost challenges all these theories that all these wars are spurred by external actors. So what do you think about that?
That's an interesting point. Like the main sort of stakeholder is China. There is a stake by India as well in Rakhine State to develop certain factories there, to have a certain capacity to want to develop it. But as far as I can tell, their interests haven't clashed yet. This is more of a long-standing ethnic battle for legitimacy and autonomy. I wouldn't say, because outside of China, the U.S. hasn't really lent full support, for example, to the democratic movement. It's sort of held itself tentatively, or the Western forces. So I wouldn't go as far as to say it's really a proxy battle, which, yeah, I guess you could say it challenges the conventional notion that modern states are going to, especially weaker states, are going to be these battlegrounds for forces that are regional giants to just contest in that small arena. No, this is mainly, the main stakeholders are Bangladesh, which it hosts this big refugee population. China, which always seeks sort of a stability in the region, right? Even if there's a new boss in town, it tries to negotiate with that new boss to keep things going, to try and have a supply line going to the Pacific, and to a lesser extent, India as well, which has its own Rohingya population, which is very small, wants to develop more of a stake with the military junta. So yeah, that's kind of how it is. And maybe there's something to be said why that's why it's less on the headlines compared to Ukraine, right? Where you have a lot more geopolitical interest at the moment.
Yeah, but also the intensity is very high, and we actually had a genocide without external interference, and so there is a tendency to think that makes these wars more intense. And here we're seeing a counter example. And it's not the first time that we've seen that the lack of involvement from great powers is associated with conflict. That was something that I'm old enough to remember people were talking about a lot at the end of the Cold War, after the end of the Cold War, that it was the neglect from the United States and the Soviet Union of these countries, especially in Africa, that led to a lot of these ethnic conflicts, and that if they went back to the kind of ideological battle that you had that strengthened states in the Cold War, maybe it would prevent it. But now people are looking at the intervention as the major cause. It almost seems like we're not really hitting at the actual cause of this. It's not really external.
Yeah, I should also point out that so Myanmar is still part of ASEAN, which is this regional. It's people try and present it as if it's a EU counterpart, but it really isn't. It's more just a sort of fraternity of like-minded or sometimes like-minded Southeast Asian states. It's been a very controversial issue of how to handle Myanmar, which is part of this community where most of the community is, like states like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. They're not really conflict-ridden states between each other, right? We did have an issue between Cambodia and Thailand that was settled recently. They haven't really brought Myanmar to task for the genocide, and there have been there have been like mild statements that are not really pressuring that have been applied, but the general sort of regional understanding, the framework is very non-interventionist. It's very much about sort of co-harmony, and it's not in our interest to really impede or to impose ourselves on your state because that could be used against us. So let's just work on like basic trade and travel and these type of areas that we can work on. And it became an issue of embarrassment, in fact, for a lot of ASEAN of how to deal with Myanmar because the case was so egregious and it's not even a democracy. At least the other states are in some form. And so I would also point that out that like regionally there hasn't been enough pushback for what happened, and this has been acknowledged. I think when Malaysia, for example, which takes in a lot of the refugees, they realize now that they're sort of bearing the cost for a lot of Myanmar's actions, right? And it doesn't, but there's a tension between being too assertive in ASEAN and establishing this idea that, oh, okay, then we can somehow interfere in other states more so than, internally interfere in other states more so than we would like to be applied to us. Hopefully that's kind of some useful context for why
You're
why they have less accountability.
you're saying they sort of have that kind of classic view of sovereignty still.
Well, yeah, sovereignty, but like, and you could say, even though I hate these terms, Asian values of
What
like
are Asian
co-harmony.
values? Please, I don't think that most people know
Well,
what you mean by that politically.
okay, so I'm in like my doctorate. I'm in a think tank here in Singapore, where the sort of IR perspective is very much talking about things from an Asian angle, but it is a generalistic view. But the idea of Asian values is focused on harmony, right? The idea that we want like mutual coexistence, right, and sort of mutual benefit, win-win scenarios, right? There is a more cynical way of looking at it, right? But
Tell us about the more
that is
cynical way. We're cynical people here.
but there to its benefit, the idea is that like you can establish more trade, you can establish more avenues of broadening your sphere of influence without necessarily imposing on how different states do their own affairs. It's you could argue it's from a Chinese playbook, but there is a different flavor of it in Southeast Asia that is very strong. The idea that we don't like too much of another state trying to impose itself on how we run our own specific state affairs, right? But let's just look at where we all agree, and then we'll just move there. The cynical side of it is that often can paper over actual systemic issues and actual issues of abuses and things that may make a state look bad, and you kind of look the other way.
It does work, I think, just empirically speaking, in terms of preventing interstate conflict, right?
Yeah,
When
yeah,
goods cross borders, soldiers don't.
yeah. I think that you could almost make a case that there is a certain cultural value to it, right? Because a lot of these regions were, they didn't have like large scale conflicts except for maybe like Japan invading in World War II or China maybe now it's not really an invasion, but there's the South China Sea,
They
there
invaded
is
Cambodia
some
in
contention.
79.
Yeah.
There's some cases, but it's really very few considering the stakes of the geopolitical tensions that you do have in that region.
Yeah. In fact, I
One
think
one
there's a
could
lot
argue
that
Cambodia had a lot to do with other actors also being involved at the same time.
Yeah, very
definitely.
specific other actors that shall remain nameless that like hamburgers and invading other countries.
Well, I think there's a lot in Southeast Asia that, like, just to speak more positively, like, there's a lot there in terms of like how they handle diversity, how they deal with, just managing disparate populations within one country. That I think is quite positive. From what I've seen, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, I quite like living in this region, and I think there's much there that we could sort of learn from compared to the EU, which is much more interventionist about their states. Like there is an understanding in the EU that each state has to abide by certain behavior to be part of this suprastate, so to speak. But ASEAN is totally, it's not near that level. It's much more just a fraternity of regional states working on things that can be mutually beneficial, but without really stepping on each other's toes.
Yeah. What can we learn from that to help us in our part of the world?
I think from you learn from like Southeast Asia or learn from the Rohingya case, you're asking.
Well, there's not much we can learn from Myanmar that's good. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong. I was thinking more about
ASEAN. I think one issue which I'm noticing a lot in the West, right, is there is, and this I'm talking internally, but there is this understanding, or this, I wouldn't even call it understanding, but just this common notion that multiculturalism has failed. You hear that all the time, right?
Yes, you do.
And I like to ask, well, okay, if multiculturalism has failed, what comes next, right? And because from what it seems is that I don't even necessarily believe that it's failed in the sense of how
it hasn't failed.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't think so, but it seems that
I don't think it's failed.
Yeah,
yeah. I think I think definitely you can talk about migration and the challenges there, but I think it's still a model that could work. But we definitely need to have lessons. Like when I look at Southeast Asia, I do see that they handle issues of race, issues of culture, multiculturalism in a much more peaceful way, but also in a way that is, I think there's some cases where it's they're a bit more frank about certain conversations that are more contentious in the West about, like the fact that somebody is very attached to their own culture or their own ways, and that we need to recognize, okay, there are differences. How do we structure a society where those differences can be accounted for, and also have maybe like a majority be at sort of peace with that? And you need to be sort of frank that these differences exist. Whereas I see in the West often, and my area is migration, so I like to study this also in the West. And I'm a Muslim American, so I have a stake in it as well. But I see in the West we're sort of stuck between two competing models. One is this idea of colorblind meritocracy, and the other, this idea that we can be specific. Like, I don't want to go into the DEI type of meme, right? But this idea that, like, okay, we sort of need to cater to a competing set of ethnic interests. And I think there could be a way to move beyond this, where we can be frank that different communities have not necessarily mutually exclusive, but different sets of interests and values, but that they have to be dealt with in a larger framework. I don't know if I'm making sense, but when you live in
to explain multiculturalism that in a way that I kind of do to a lot of people, is what you have to realize is what you're talking about is actually a free market in culture. You're basically, the culture war is inherent. So like if you had and if you had a real free market in any industry, the idea is that it fails every day, right? And the failures, though, are localized in a one specific spot. And so multiculturalism is doomed to fail every day, but those failures are localized. Certain pieces of people's culture might get left behind after several generations, but that's because those people don't want to keep that part, and then they absorb something else. You ask the American, average American, they like sushi, they like, using chopsticks, they like learning a new language, they like, it's kind of that's what the melting pot actually is it's accepting that the culture war is part of life and putting it into the discussion box rather than putting it into the warfare box. And so honestly, I would argue that multiculturalism is not only so successful in America, it is a model that we have to apply to world relations. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Like it's kind of actually a bit different. Like Southeast Asia, a lot of it is state managed, maybe to an extent that I feel is can be, that can't be replicated in the West. But people are very frank about, like, okay, if you're like, for example, in Singapore, you have three major populations: the Chinese, the Malay, who are Muslim, and then the Indian, who are mainly historically migrants from South Asia. And the government has a very sort of hands-on role in trying to assert a type of multicultural harmony while recognizing that they're culturally distinct people. What I can say is useful from that is that conversations on race or identity became so contentious in the US at a certain point, and now it's sort of overcompensating in the other direction, often in ugly ways, which I think are very concerning, right?
I
But
agree. That's why I think you
yeah, but
can't like force the culture war. You have to like just kind of let it play out. You can't put too much, enforcement. You can't have too many legislation around it. You just got to let it play out. Let the hippies fight the straights and create the 90s kid.
well,
That's what it's got to happen.
Growing up in the States in the 90s and early 2000s, I thought we had solved race. I don't
That's
know
what I'm
if, like,
saying.
I
Oh, we
do
did. We
remember,
did. We told everything's been solved. Don't worry about it.
yeah. I mean, I remember it was actually like you had Chappelle. He made fun of like black people, white people, but like there was this vibe there that it's very hard to capture in words, but there was this vibe there that people were sort of not triggered by these type of conversations. I didn't think we solved it, but we had definitely made a lot of headway.
We
And
were
to
at the
see where
point
things
where
are,
it was like that was the old people and we're making fun of them. We're past that. You
yeah,
know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah. And now I feel we've, in many ways, kind of gone to the opposite. Like I'm listening to the rise of like Nick Fuentes, right, and this type of white identitarianism, and I definitely see why young people find his appeal, because many of them think it's sort of transgressive and they want to push against the system and they want to be against this type of PC culture. That's completely understandable. My only problem is the idea of stigmatizing entire groups, right? If that becomes sort of a legacy, that can lead to civil strife. I feel like if you sort of attach type of negative association to entire groups of people, like Jews, blacks, women, etc., you're sort of setting the grounds for yeah, I feel potentially dangerous consequences. That's sort of my contention. But the problem is, I think that you don't have much of a counter argument in his party, right? The sort of conservative side to what he's doing, because they're also identitarian as well. It's just that he's sort of taken it to his logical extreme. Sorry, I hope we're not diverting by going into these
Yeah, a
topics.
little bit, but it's fine. Yeah, let's actually
Yeah,
move back to Myanmar and talk about what we haven't done so far, which is how do we
which is what can be done.
exactly, how do we settle this?
Yeah.
What can we do to move towards a resolution of this conflict?
I think, yeah. So definitely, right now it's at an impasse in terms of where it is in Myanmar. One simple thing is just paying more attention to the fact that there's this conflict. Given that what's happening in Gaza, I think that people who are existing sort of genocide victims more light can be shed on their cases, especially to draw the parallels, because there are many parallels that exist between the way that the Rohingya were dehumanized versus how that happened to the Palestinians. So just shedding more light on their case. One is also pushing, I think, towards this idea of a democratic transition for Myanmar, which would necessitate the return of the Rohingya people, and having that express more on forums, because right now there is a significant lack of Western pressure, which that is a form of leverage that does influence the sort of decision makers in the Tatmadaw, in the military junta, whereas the sense is the West is distracted with other conflicts, so they sort of let the ball go. And I think there needs to be a renewed effort to increase pressure and to push for more of a democratic transition. I think that's important, and just awareness about the conditions that the Rohingya are suffering from, and then the parallels that can be drawn towards this, what I say is a common idea that there should be genocide happening in the 21st century, right? It's sort of a betrayal of our humanity that we've allowed it to happen, live streamed to us, of course, in the last 2 years, but also before that. Yeah. And what's interesting is that many Israeli Israeli policymakers and representatives did recognize the Rohingya genocide. And, even as they contest this one, but it was considered fairly, straightforward for them to see. I think that I find is very useful because what happened in Gaza is just more industrialized, high tech version of what was done to the Palestinians. Creating this wider awareness would, I think, be very useful.
So, are there what aid groups would you say are working on the ground that are actually doing the good work? That are actually helping some people. And what is actually the aid that is more critically necessary? Are they running more low on food? Are they running more low on medical treatment? Where are they at in that situation?
I mean, in terms of the most pressing need for aid is in the Cox's Bazar camp in Bangladesh, because you have over 1 million refugees there, and they've now been there for since 2017. But actually, there was a population there before that as well. And when the Ukraine conflict happened, there was a big drop in aid for those refugees in Cox's Bazar. And a lot of that aid was shifted to Ukraine. But the problem is that as the conditions deteriorate in the camps, one is food aid is cut. So there's definitely a big demand for food aid because the food rations are barely enough for them to survive. But also in terms of medical supply, because when winter comes in that area, it's very hard for many of the refugees to survive in those conditions. There's a lot of flooding in Bangladesh, and particularly in that area. So there's a need for stronger and more sustainable housing. So it's UNHCR that mainly deals with them there, and they're very much pressed beyond their means at the moment because they're simultaneously working to help these conditions in the camps, as well as to try and repatriate the Rohingya back home, which is very difficult to do as long as the conflict there is continuing.
You mentioned the importance of democratization in Myanmar, but there's a lot of research that suggests, and a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that democratization tends to increase ethnic tensions, at least in the short term, due to sort of, the kind of populist ethnic policies that come so easily to politicians in ethnically divided countries. Isn't there a danger that more democratization in Myanmar might actually lead to even more demonization of Muslims like the Rohingya and other minority groups?
I mean, it's a good question. That's one reason why I think Western entities and advocates that are supporting the democratic movement are a bit tentative, because they make it a precondition that you have to, at least in principle, accept that the return of Rohingya is part of your framework for a new Myanmar. But that has to be sort of coupled with a de-radicalization among a certain section of the populace that are still have a lot of antipathy towards the Rohingya and have this widespread perception that the Rohingya are foreigners or Bengali. That, I think, will take a long time, though. It's not going to happen immediately. Does that mean that we forestall democracy? I don't think so, because I think that what is the essential problem is the nature of the state, right? This idea of which I mentioned earlier, this ethnocracy that becomes a basis for, one is reinforcing a sort of Barmar majority ethnic identity of the state, and then also having the different ethnicities contest each other. Until that's really addressed, you're going to have, I think that reinforces a lot of the ethnic tensions that happen in the country. Now, does that mean that if you transition, suddenly the tensions are going to subside? I don't think so. I think there is a case to be made. In fact, the last democratic transition showed that you can still have hostilities that still exist and that will continue. I think it's important to have some type of de-radicalization program, even a period of transition that would allow the population to at least make peace with the Rohingya neighbors. How that happens, though, is very debatable. It's one reason why many of the Rohingya feel they're between a rock and a hard place, being sort of stuck in diaspora and as a refugee diaspora, but the idea that if they go back home, they may still face a lot of persecution. So the main issue is how do you not have a Myanmar that has to see itself primarily through the basis of ethnic lens vis-a-vis the state. I think that has to be a key point to address first before you can expect the populace to be de-radicalized.
And, you know, one of the problems that we have, you talked about solutions, more awareness. One of the problems that we're finding right now with the international system and the current international situation is that there's just no bandwidth for all these conflicts. It's even hard to blame people. Everyone has their own problems in their lives. And then there's the one or two cause celeb, which also aren't getting as much attention as they should in terms of solutions. And then there's the second tier, and then there's the third tier, and there's the fourth tier of conflicts. I've tried to make it my mission a little bit to raise awareness for these conflicts. There's so many of them, I don't even know. And then also there's all this isolationism, America first
My poor
stuff
friends.
that is making people donate less to humanitarian
Yes.
concerns and worry less about what's happening abroad just at a time when we need it most. And I find that when I talk to experts like yourself or think about it myself, the solutions that we offer are completely unrealistic to the current situation. Almost like there's no way to solve a lot of this with the current constellation of interests and resources and attitudes. So what do we do in this really depressing environment that we are currently in?
I mean, it's a great point. You had the former Home Minister of UK, who, I don't know if you remember that, she was sort of casting doubt about the UN Refugee Convention, which is very depressing, right? And like, oh, it was overly charitable, and it's not sustainable. And of course, in the United States, the mood is very. I do debate this though, because I wonder how much of this is online versus mood generated. Because I checked a statistic the other day where what percent of the Republican Party is in favor of reducing immigration, legal immigration, and it's only 30% of the Republican Party. And when I look at other polls, it depends on the context, right? Yeah, in some cases, attitudes have hardened a lot towards the international regime. But the way I would frame it is that these institutions, the sort of loss of legitimacy for a lot of these institutions, I mean, that damage is real. I mean, Gaza has not helped that. It's just sort of accelerated. But to the extent that we can, I think we should emphasize that these institutions are a Western, they are a Western product. Like there's something part of the legacy of Western achievement that can be appreciated, like when we talk about the Geneva Accords, and these are actually things that are part of a legacy that those who are American or European should actually be proud of. I mean, as it's not something that it's being framed now that this is a foreign globalist intervention that is being imposed on our nationalist aspirations, but it's actually a byproduct of America and in this type of hegemony. But it's never framed that way, which I find unfortunate. I also think we need to appeal to multipolarity. We need to look
Yes.
at other regimes or other countries forming blocs that can sort of reassert these interests. And if I'm just talking about the future, I think there's more of a avenue there for actually making any headway into conflict resolution than just pure dependence on the West. Like if for example, we saw Qatar hold a emergency meeting after that recent incident where Israel struck them, where they managed to get many Muslim countries together for an emergency sort of consultation. I actually see that these type of regional coalitions forming as a good counterbalance to just pure Western-centric determinism. And in a way, I hope that we can leverage that more, and sort of activate that more, because we are sort of brought up in a system where we're still taking sort of marching cues from, you know, DC and, you know, Brussels, etc. We need to sort of move away from that mindset strategically and see how and away from the lethargy of other regional coalitions and formations, and get them more activated. It'll take time, but
Yeah.
I'm more hopeful there that we can actually move towards conflict resolutions. Like, I actually think that it's in many of the Muslim countries' own interest to actually see these conflicts be resolved than appealing to maybe a Western centric model. So, for example, it was China who actually normalized relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which helped lead towards, you know, resolving Yemen, at least for the time being, as this proxy war. It wasn't the U.S., right? And perhaps we are limited in our thinking at the moment by expecting that the United States has to set the tone. It's great if it does, but I don't think in the current mood in the West, where it's retrenching itself, we can hold very high expectations. And I think it's better to look towards new forming regional coalitions to actually take that baton. So I am mildly hopeful in multilateralism and multipolarity as offering at least some avenues towards conflict resolution, because it's appealing more towards self-interest to have a stable region where you could have trade. But it also means with the breakup of, or this Western order finding itself in the retreat, can mean many more conflicts also erupt. So it's sort of a dual, yeah, it's just sort of both sides of the coin you kind of have to deal with. I don't know. What do you think, Shaiel?
Yeah, I would. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Shaiel. He
Oh,
asked
Daniel.
you.
Yeah, sorry. Go for it, Daniel.
I definitely do want to know the answer to that question, Shaiel. But also, one thing I would point out is that, like, the multipolar world is in everyone's interest. It's not just in the US's interest, because if you actually sit here and think about it from the US's standpoint, how much we end up spending to try to make sure that we have this hegemony. You know, it's trillions of dollars. So it's in our interest to be able to back away from that, and say Ukraine is more of a European problem. Let Europe handle it. It would be a lot better if we had these spheres of influence handling these localized issues. So that way we're not involved and implicated in every single fight that happens, and we're not getting looked at sideways. This is a lot of where the international community is looked at sideways, is because there is this imbalance on how the law is enforced, because it's like, if you're a US or a US ally, we're going to completely ignore what you did because we don't want to piss off basically the only thing backing this international organization in the first place. So when you have this decentralized power, you end up with a lot better world for everyone involved. They're able to hold the U.S. accountable if the U.S. does something they don't like, and vice versa. We don't look like we're just running the world. We're the new Roman Empire.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that point, what I'm seeing is that a lot of these tools of the international order are now just sort of being more blatantly used in cases where a state feels solidarity or an interest in another state, and then they're going to employ it. Whereas before, you have to make a very convoluted argument why we should do it, why we shouldn't, right? Now it's just like, no, okay, this is my interest, so I'm going to use these tools to get something done. So like when Trump, for example, he brings in, he stopped the refugee program, but then he brings in the South African, I don't know if you heard about the white South African sort of farmers in. I mean, that's sort of, okay, it's for political points, but it's sort of just saying, yeah, I agree in this sort of international principle of like repatriation or reform. I'm just doing it for the people I feel solidarity with, right? And I'm sure if we have another Republican administration like a Vance or a Rubio, they're going to do it for like maybe Christians in the Middle East, right? Are going to be like our case for
Latin American socialist countries like Venezuela, Cuba.
Right. So
I could see that happening very soon.
It's going to become more used as opposed into a place of pure merit. It's going to be replaced with who do we feel solidarity with. We're going to shape the international order towards that. I think that the world is just moving towards that, where states are just more frank about what was probably a hidden reality before, where they have to make deference to international norms and a global framework, United Nations resolution, this or that. Now it's going to be about, no, like we're concerned about these people who are close to our people, and we're going to do X, Y, Z.
Even if they were illusions, they were very useful illusions, because if you look at the
They
number
were.
of refugees that the United States took in the past, it was not optimal, but it was so much higher. You would take in 100, 200, 300,000. Now they're taking in 7,000, and most of them are, South African
Yeah.
apartheid supporters.
And it's sad, because that's something Americans should genuinely be proud of, right? That you're actually helping victims of conflict, right? Of course, that now they're just seen as migrants, more migrants, which and again, I'm very loath to think that actually a majority of Americans think that. I think it's a very loud minority who tend to dominate that debate. I would think that even if a majority of Americans, you could probably sell the case if you pursued it more aggressively, of why we need to have a sort of moral standing, and it's not detrimental to our interest to embrace norms that we instituted in the first place.
I just don't
Right?
think that
I mean,
Americans believe in a lot of those values anymore. I think that's the
yeah.
problem. A lot of Americans don't believe in those values at all, and a lot of Americans believe in them in a very weak way, and what used to be very robust. I used to, in my research back when I was a graduate student, I used to do American foreign policy. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was how American foreign policy makers really, with some exceptions, believed in their bullshit. They really believed in their ideology. When you have these candid
Yeah.
discussions between them, they really believed that they were trying to make the world better, safer for democracy. And I'm sure that if you looked at those conversations today, you'd see none of that. You'd see
No,
complete
no, it's yeah.
transactional.
So that mask is sort of fallen off. I agree with you
It's not
though.
even a
Like, for
mask.
example,
It's much deeper. It used to be part of the American identity, and it's not anymore.
and I would say it used to be part of the Western identity.
Yeah.
Because like, just to give a very sort of soft example, right? At the start of the millennium, they had the Millennium Development Goals. I don't know if you remember those, right? Now they have the Sustainable Development Goals, but there used to be a lot of sort of. It actually did push. It did motivate a lot of people to a lot of countries to do certain actions towards that. I mean, they didn't end up meeting a lot of the goals, but there was some impetus towards it. There was at least some level of, you could say, there was some catch into that idea of multilateralism and international frameworks where you could collaborate. Now I don't see that necessarily, that level of appetite, right?
Yeah.
And so I agree with you there about the cynicism. I do think, though, that there is a case to be made for regional sort of counterparts. Once, like, if there's a decline of the West and they become more isolationist, I think you do have an international environment that has been so conditioned by the this sort of unipolar world that it'll take time for them to really assert themselves regionally. But I do think there's a case to be made, just out of regional self-interest, you could pursue a lot more conflict resolution. But it's going to take time. In the meantime, and it is sad, because then they won't be appealing on grounds of, like, necessarily United Nations resolutions. They'll probably be appealing on quite different grounds. But to me, that's sort of my silver lining in this dark cloud at the moment.
So yeah, as we end this, what are the important takeaways we should have about the situation in Myanmar?
Yeah. So one is that it's still ongoing. The main pressing issue is to have a transition in Myanmar towards a democratic setup that allows for not just the return of the Rohingya and restitution of their full rights of citizenship, but also an end to this type of ethnocratic type of setup, and towards one where you can provide a type of civic nationalism. And to do that, we need to sort of reactivate the conversation, but also draw parallels as much as we can with the attention towards Gaza and this sort of revival of interest in genocide and victims of genocide. And I also think for those even outside the activist space, if they want to learn more about other parallel examples of how this genocide is conducted, I think the sort of Rohingya case is very much a very sort of clear, distinct example of a sort of steady erosion and otherization leading to a situation of mass violence that you can use and you could sort of compare. So that would be my main takeaway. And I want to thank you for giving the platform.
Thank you so
Oh
much for
yeah,
coming.
definitely. Thanks for coming.
This was a great,
Yeah, no,
great conversation. And yeah,
yeah,
Excellent conversation.
if there's new
yeah.
developments in Myanmar, we'll be happy to have you back on.
Awesome,
course, yeah.
awesome. Yeah, well, I enjoyed the chat. I even appreciated talking about the other issues. In fact, I mean, it would be interesting to have like a conversation about like what happens as like looking at the harm of to the international order from Gaza, and then seeing what can actually be done. Because I've done a bit of thinking about this because I'm sure like you've lost a lot of faith in many of these institutions, right? And we're sort of at a loss, right, for what to do exactly.
Dude,
And I'm an anarchist, so I never had faith in the first
I
place.
kind of envy you.
There you go.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even watch the NBA and Major League Baseball anymore and have faith in those institutions. I mean, I've lost faith in everything, man.
Yeah. Well, I would say like we're red pilled, but I don't even know what we're red pilled on. We're just sort of like, disenfranchised or just like disenchanted with the entire thing. But yeah. But keep up your good work, Shaiel, and
Thank you
thank
so
you
much for coming on. I'll be following what you're doing much more closely.
Well, I
course,
don't
yeah.
necessarily post on my Rohingya stuff on my main account. My main account, my anonymous account is just like me shooting the breeze of whatever.
DM me. DM
opinions.
me with any updates.
Yeah, but I'll send you once I have stuff.
It's one of the
I'll
conflicts
send
I
you.
want to
Thank you.
follow and don't enough. So, yeah.
Same.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right,
DM me.
everyone. Have a wonderful night.